You know, we're surrounded by invisible signals all the time, right? Like 5G. But what if a little golden box could actually shield you from them? Well, we're about to dive into a really fascinating scientific study that put that very claim to the test.
So that's the big question, right? Could this little golden box really shield your body from 5G? That's the exact question a company brought to a team of scientists. I mean, it's a pretty bold claim, and the only way you're going to get a real answer is through some serious, impartial testing.
And that company was Leela Quantum Tech. They really wanted to see if their device could scientifically back up its claims of 5G protection. So they commissioned a formal study from the Bion Institute over in Slovenia. And this group, well, they specialize in designing exactly this kind of experiment.
All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to follow the scientist's path. We'll start with the initial question, look at how they designed the perfect test, see how they measured the body's response, decode all that data, and then finally, we'll get to the study's official verdict.
Okay, Section 1, a quantum shield for 5G. So let's start with the big picture here. Why was this study even necessary in the first place?
You know, with 5G rolling out everywhere, this whole market has popped up for products claiming to offer protection. The Bion Institute's job was to cut through all that marketing noise and find out, did the Leela Quantum Bloc have any measurable biological effect on a person who's being exposed to a 5G signal? Simple as that.
All right, on to Section 2, designing the perfect test. So how do you even begin to design an experiment that gives you a truly reliable answer? This is where good science really gets to shine.
Okay, so to get results they could actually trust, the scientists used what's basically the gold standard of clinical research. First, the test was double-blind. That means neither the person being tested nor the assistant knew if the device was the real one or a fake. It was also placebo-controlled, so they used an identical-looking but totally non-functional sham device. And finally, it was randomized, mixing up the test order for each person. The whole point of this setup? To eliminate any and all chance of bias.
So each of the 16 volunteers was tested under these three very specific situations. You had your baseline control state, then a 5G exposure state, and finally, the Leela block protective state. The idea here is actually pretty simple. If the device works, the body's response while using it should look a whole lot more like that calm control state, and not the 5G exposed state.
So for 35 minutes at a time, each participant just sat there quietly, all hooked up to sensors with their hand inside one of the devices. Now, the physical setup was exactly the same for every single test. The only things that changed were whether the phone was on or off and whether the device itself was the real deal or that inert sham.
Okay, Section 3, measuring the body's response. So how in the world do you measure something invisible, like the influence of 5G or the effect of a so-called quantum device? Well, the researchers tapped into the body's own involuntary feedback systems.
The first key thing they looked at was skin conductance. Now you can think of this as your body's unconscious stress meter. It's measuring tiny changes in sweat on your fingertips, which is directly linked to your sympathetic nervous system. That's the system that kicks into fight or flight mode when you're stressed. It's a classic way to measure a physiological stress response.
They also kept an eye on finger temperature. It's a subtle thing, but when your body's under stress, it often pulls blood flow away from your hands and feet and sends it toward your core organs. This can cause a small but totally measurable drop in finger temperature, making it another really useful marker for stress or, for relaxation.
And finally, they used something called an electromyogram, or EMG, to monitor muscle tension. This is a direct measurement of how active your muscles are. Now, it's really important to remember that while tension can be a sign of stress, it's not always a bad thing. It can also mean you're more alert, or focused, or even invigorated. So keep that little detail in mind.
All right, Section 4, decoding the data. So the tests are done, now it was time to crunch the numbers and see what story they told. And believe me, this is where things get really interesting.
So let's look at the results for skin conductance. Remember, that's our stress meter. The data here is pretty clear. 5G exposure by itself definitely caused a noticeable jump in physiological stress. But, and this is the key part, when the Leela block was active, that stress response was significantly reduced. It brought it almost all the way back down to the calm baseline level. And this wasn't just a small change, it was a statistically significant finding. And what's cool is we see a very similar pattern with finger temperature. 5G exposure clearly messed with the body's temperature regulation, but with the Leela block in the mix, the body's temperature response stayed much closer to that calm, no 5G control state.
This really suggests the device was helping the body maintain its physiological stability, even with that 5G signal active.
But then we get to the muscle tension data, and this revealed a total surprise. The Leela block didn't just bring the body back to its baseline, it actually caused a statistically significant increase in muscle tension, even more than in the control or the 5G conditions. So the researchers interpreted this not as stress, but as a separate, kind of invigorating effect coming from the product itself.
Okay, let's wrap this up. Section 5, the study's final verdict. So after looking at all this evidence, what did the scientist actually conclude?
Well, in typical, careful scientific fashion, the conclusion was very precisely worded. Based on their data, the researchers stated that the product, and I'm quoting here, exerts an effect that compensates, at least partially, for the impact of 5G. So what this really highlights is that under these very specific test conditions, they did find evidence of a protective effect.
So the big takeaway here is that it's nuanced. The study basically found evidence for two different things. First, a protective effect that seemed to lessen the body's stress response to 5G. And second, a completely separate, independent stimulating effect. And of course, like any good scientific report, it concludes by saying more research is needed to confirm all this and to figure out exactly how it all works. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it? This whole experiment was built on the idea of using the human body itself as this super sensitive detector for subtle environmental influences. So as this kind of methodology gets more and more refined, you have to wonder, what other invisible forces in our world might we be able to measure and understand in the future?